Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies. Thank you for joining us. This is a rescheduled conversation, an event that unfortunately had to be changed at the last minute. So apologies to those of you who originally were expecting to attend this conversation last week, and thanks to those of you who are coming afresh or now the rescheduled date works better for you. I'm really excited for this conversation and to talk about this really interesting, important, and in many ways innovative report by Ike Freiman and Hugo Bromley, which I think is the best, most substantive piece of work done yet on an absolutely vital topic of thinking about the intersection between economics, finance, strategy, Taiwan, the United States, and the global economy. We've had, certainly since the visit to Taiwan of August 2022 of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, there's just been a dramatically new conversation on the risks to the global economy, the risks to the United States economy, stemming from a crisis or a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. This is now an issue of great importance, as we've also seen the reliance that the global economy has on Taiwan itself through leading semiconductor firms like TSMC to really power the global economy. And yet, for how important this is, there has been a dearth of thinking and research on how are we going to navigate this? Not just how do we think about building resiliency within our respective economies, but if there is a sudden, sharp crisis, a blockade, an invasion, how is the United States and how are policymakers going to navigate this? What is the right response that we adopt in the minutes, days, and years following such a crisis? And more importantly, what steps do we take today to better prepare ourselves, not just the United States, but our allies and partners to be able to navigate this? And so, again, couldn't think of two better guests to come on to talk about this. The reason they're here is they have written this fantastic Hoover Institution report called On Day One, an economic contingency plan for a Taiwan crisis. The authors are Ike Freiman, who's a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University and a non-resident research fellow at the China Maritime Studies Institution at the U.S. Naval War College, excuse me, and Hugo Bromley, who's a research associate at the Center for Geopolitics and an affiliated research associate at Robertson College. Ike, Hugo, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jude. And I should begin by saying that CSIS has done some really foundational and exciting work in this space. So this is one of those conversations we've been really looking forward to. And Ike and I aren't going to speak for very long. We're going to try and get into questions as fast as possible. But as you say, this is a subject that needs more thinking and more work, because when we first settled down to write about this, we felt that in the Washington conversation, too often thinking about economic contingency planning in Taiwan fell into a binary. There were some who didn't want to think about it or didn't see a Taiwan crisis as plausible, saw the economic cost as too high. And there were others who were thinking in terms of what one might call Russia plus, right? The suite of financial sanctions we've developed over the last 30 years. We can talk about the intellectual history of that if people are interested, but adapted for the China case. What we've tried to do is help get that conversation out of that binary and think about different ways of economic contingency planning that respect the broader suite of US and allied interests in a Taiwan crisis. So the way we're going to do this is Ike's going to talk a bit about those interests. I'm going to come back in on some principles that we think should be the foundation of the conversation on economic contingency planning. And then we'll talk briefly about some policy pathways that would operationalize them.
Great. Let me just make one quick logistical intervention, which is we believe in mass democracy at CSIS and mass participation. If you go to the CSIS website and click the event page for this specific event, there is a box at the bottom. I see people are already utilizing it, but for those who haven't seen it yet, at any point, please input your question. These are starting to stack up now. I'm going to try to layer these into the conversation. But appreciate anyone's comments or questions to help integrate into the conversation. So, comrades, again, let me turn it over to you for some introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Comrade Blanchette, for the honor of the invitation. As Hugo says, we are not thinking about specific scenarios here. We're not taking a position on whether an invasion, a blockade, a quarantine, or some other possibility is more likely than others. Instead, the way that our argument begins is by positing what we call a break glass scenario. We are imagining a world in which China has taken actions that cross US red lines, and as a result, there's a bipartisan consensus in Congress that the economic relationship has to change fundamentally, and in fact that the United States has to decouple its economic and financial relationship entirely from China, though not necessarily all at once. A big chunk of the report is dedicated to analyzing that scenario, including using some historical inspirations like the outbreak of World War I, the outbreak of COVID-19, among others. And we begin by thinking about what US strategic and economic interests would be relevant in that scenario. Now, clearly, if you imagine a world where China has done something so egregious that such a bipartisan consensus would emerge, there would be a US interest, if not a political demand, to find ways of punishing China economically. But that's not the only US and allied interest that would be relevant here. First and foremost, we would have an interest in maintaining macroeconomic and financial stability in the United States and indeed in allied countries and around the world. That means preventing a spike in the unemployment rate, shortages and inflation that would crush American households. We would have an interest in breaking our dependence on China's market and helping our allies and partners do the same. That would be critical for reducing our vulnerability to China's economic coercion over the long term. We would have an interest in maintaining the central role of the dollar in the global financial and trading system. The dollar undergirds so much of American prosperity. It also allows us to enforce our existing sanctions and export controls on countries like Russia and North Korea. We would have an interest in maintaining a rules-based trading system because in this post-conflict moment, the United States would need to keep trading with other countries, not necessarily China, but we would want to make sure that we could continue to trade with those countries in such a way that products from China that might pose a threat in some way couldn't move into our market, and that we could control the export of our own products to China. So we think it's unrealistic and unwise to do contingency planning that is solely aimed at thinking about how we could impose maximum pain on China on day one, because we need at least one item on the menu that would meet some balance of all of these interests at once.
So when we're thinking about how to design that, we go back, I mean, as Ike says, we're both historians by training, and we go back to two people on a boat, namely Churchill and Roosevelt and the Atlantic Charter, which outlined some fundamental principles about how world systems would function after the conflict. And those principles were kind of woolly in many ways, but the reason they're so important is that they provide guiding points, or provided guiding points, for building consensus. So it's sort of inspired by that big history that we think about what principles should underpin such a contingency plan. And we really highlight four. The first is that it's not viable to ask firms, even US firms, to break supply chains on day one in non-critical sectors. And firms are going to need to be given adequate time to reshore. Remember, we're drawing a distinction here. We maintain the Biden administration's distinction here between de-risking and decoupling. So we're talking about the broad sweep of US-China trade rather than those few specific critical sectors. And in those cases, the economic cost of doing a harder option on day one is going to be too much. The second is the overwhelming importance of the dollar, as Ike says, and the importance of taking steps to sustain that and not taking steps that put it at risk. The third is where things get much more interesting, and we argue that it is not viable in the world in which we live to interdict third countries' trade with China. And in fact, the US should conceive of what it is doing in response to a Taiwan crisis as economic recovery and response that includes decoupling from China, rather than economic warfare and punishment, and should frame its thinking in those terms. Finally, any effort to decouple from China in the trade space, which is what those three principles take you towards, is going to give you a fundamental problem with transshipment. And we've seen this already with some of the things that have been done by the Trump and Biden administrations on China, right? I want to import a Chinese product into the United States. I import it into a third country. I scratch out made in China, or I add made in something else on, and then I ship it on. That's going to be your biggest fundamental challenge in a during and post Day One world. And to respond to that, the United States needs to create a rules-based, incentive-led system that brings countries through their own appreciation of national interests to hit what we think of as the minimum bar, which is honesty of trade reporting. And that's really key, because that point does not require those countries to condemn the invasion of Taiwan or decouple from China themselves. It just requires honesty in trade reporting. So based on those principles, we outline two basic policy pathways that we'll just talk about briefly before getting into questions. You're on mute, I think.
Pardon me. The first is some kind of ratcheting regime for taking our non-critical trade with China to zero over a period of time. If I were to sum up the process that Hugo was just describing in a pithy slogan, it would be an avalanche, which is why we put an avalanche on the cover of our report. The idea being that on day one or immediately thereafter, the United States and partner countries would scramble to finish the de-risking process, anything that was really critical. Pharmaceutical ingredients, for example, if we haven't brought those back in advance of a crisis, that would be the first priority. Chips, other things like that. The question really that we're asking here is, what do we do about the non-critical trade? The household supplies, the Nike sneakers. And the argument we're making is that the best way to do this is not to command and control how those supply chains come out of China, not to pick winners in terms of what firms will make them, what countries will enjoy that manufacturing, but rather to set up a process that is driven by incentives and market forces in which private firms and capital markets can look around the world and say, well, if I won't be able to make this stuff in China in 5 years or what have you, where should I bring my production back to? And allowing them to make rational capital allocation efficient decisions on that basis. If you want to do that, then you can't move your ratcheting trade policy in an ad hoc way. You have to put in motion a process that is embedded in law, which means Congress would have to do it, such that either tariffs will move up by a small increment every month or a quota moves down. And once that ratchet process is in motion, in principle, it would remain in motion until market forces begin to bring production out of China at scale.
That still leaves you with the transshipment problem and also the point about US economic leadership in what would be a time of massive crisis. And as Alex says, we go back to World War I, and the word that just keeps coming up is paralysis, right? This would be a moment of paralysis and shock in financial markets. So the way we conceive of doing this is that you would create a thing, call it an economic security cooperation board, that you would invite states to join, and you give it two mandates that you intertwine. The first is it's the US vehicle for economic leadership and support, right? It's going to step in as we did during COVID, as we did during 2008. But the second mandate is honesty of trade reporting. And it would have a rules-based way of sustaining a claim that a country had become a transshipment point. And if a country did become a transshipment point, it would get support to set up customs procedures. It might lose some access to US financial and dollar support. But ultimately, that institution would say, okay, you're now transshipping in a sustained way. The US gets to treat you like China, either in a sector or overall. In other words, we're taking the biggest challenge and we're throwing at it our biggest carrot, which is access to the US market as supply chains begin to move. All right, I'm going to stop talking in a moment. But the way to think about this, I think, is this. There's a conceptual debate, and I go back to that binary earlier, about whether in a crisis we should be aiming for certainty and or uncertainty. And the argument for uncertainty is that we threaten something like dollar sanctions, right? Like financial blocking sanctions, which are the biggest, scariest thing possible. And maybe we would do them, maybe we wouldn't, but the fear has a deterrent effect. The problem with that is that the politics and geopolitics of Taiwan are so complicated that we run a serious risk of deterring ourselves because we would be the people drawing the line. And we would be the people disrupting the global economy. And as a result, what we're contending is that what we should try and do is aim for, if not certainty, at least a contingency plan that we would want to do anyway, because it respects the broad suite of our interests, including punishing China and breaking our dependence and our allies' dependence, a crucial point on the Chinese market, but not limited to that. And that way, by calmly contingency planning for the worst case scenarios, we can maintain the most effective deterrent possible.
Great. Well, thanks to you both. That was a very good summary of the report, although I should just say for readers, the report is 121 pages. So if you're thinking, well, yes, what about, I will just say that the full report is worth your time to read. Let me just a few reaction questions. And again, we've had some discussions on this before. So my first question will not surprise you, but it is one that sticks in my head as being one of the most salient. And it's something that you have both said about the avoidance of picking specific, concrete, discrete scenarios to plan around. And instead just trying to essentially create a toolkit that is there for whenever policymakers decide that we have reached that threshold or that red line, whatever that may be. I think if we're imagining that that an event that catalyzes the willingness to move from status quo to a much more active position of some limited decoupling immediately in some critical sectors, and then creating this avalanche of non-critical sectors over time, we've moved way up the escalation ladder, and we're at something that is approximating, if not an outright war, a very clear blockade or some scenario of that type. I guess the first question is, if we're at a point where we are on the precipice of an actual conflict between the United States and China, or are in the conflict, how much are these economic dynamics going to really matter? Because I think when folks think about a conflict between the United States and China, first and second largest economy, both possess nuclear weapons, and great uncertainties about the duration, the spread of a conflict, the possibility that we may be into World War III. Something that Gerard DePippo and I wrote is, in our estimation, the conflict is the sanction, that the costs flow inevitably. A large amount of decoupling is going to happen de facto, because we're going to see a great severing and disruption of the global economy driven by a conflict which is potentially prolonged. How do you think about that? Is it just that that's hard to plan for, and at some point there's going to be some invisible hand of violence which determines what that looks like, and so you're thinking about additional tools, or do you think that these tools that you've outlined here still apply in a scenario where we're actually in a hot war with China?
I think there's two things I'd say, and then I'll let Ike come in on some other points where he's done far more work than I. The first thing to say is that in the build-up to something like a blockade or a harsh quarantine, escalation dominance is key. And having a coherent contingency plan for the implication of some kind of harsh blockade strengthens deterrence in the gray zone. Because if you can align allies around something coherent that you would do in the worst case, that strengthens your capacity to act and deter. My nightmare is that we begin to move into much more scary gray zone contexts over Taiwan. And the conversation we're having is not a united front deterring China from moving further, but a very panicky conversation between US allies and between the United States and third countries about whether we would apply sanctions if this happened, and whether we would apply sanctions if that happened, and on what. And then we end up deterring ourselves from making clear positive statements of reassurance to Taiwan. So that would be my first answer. My second answer is on the absolute hot war scenario. I think you and Jared are absolutely right? Huge conflict in the Taiwan Strait does a lot of decoupling automatically. However, when we're thinking about this, we are trying to persuade Xi, and we don't know what he thinks, right? We can never know what he thinks, that it is not worth it to move militarily. One crucial part of that is persuading him that if he can move successfully militarily and achieve a political or military victory in a short span of time, there will not then be an overwhelming pressure to lift whatever economic measures we have put on, and that what we are doing is sustainable over the long term. Even in the worst conflicts, commerce finds a way, right? Even in World War I always think of this as the canning problem for when British soldiers arrived at a German trench in 1914 and thought, that canned food looks familiar. It was British, smuggled across through Denmark, right? Even in the worst circumstances, trade finds a way. But the challenge in those hot war scenarios, or when we're thinking about them, is persuading the PRC that it can't just move, survive a temporary period of deprivation, and then everyone is going to want to go back to normal. So it's about thinking about something that we can conceive of and do that is sustainable over the long term.
I think Hugo has laid that out very well. I just want to make two small points. First, we saw a perfect example of the ally coordination problem in late 2021 and early 2022 in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine did not take us by surprise. The US intelligence community saw it coming several months in advance. Unfortunately, we decided that our response was going to be primarily economic. We telegraphed that publicly. And then when we held consultations with close allies, it seemed that oil and gas were off the table. And that allowed Vladimir Putin to calculate, in fact, incorrectly, that the economic blow that he would suffer as a result of attacking Ukraine would be small and survivable. So given the relative significance of China's trade to the global economy, one can only imagine how difficult it would be and how much it might undermine deterrence if South Korea, Singapore, other countries that are very dependent on trade with China stood up for their own interests in negotiations with us in advance. The second point is, in any crisis scenario, the United States is going to have to do a lot to maintain domestic macroeconomic stability and to prevent the global financial system from imploding. And we saw this most recently during COVID, when central banks had to step up as the lenders of last resort. And essentially, many of the old rules and norms that constrain them were thrown away because it was such a unique crisis moment. Whatever disruptions take place in trade flows in the Western Pacific as a result of the conflict over Taiwan, there is a lot that the United States and allied countries are going to have to do anyway. And we want to make sure that those contingency planning processes are integrated in an interest-based way into a discussion of what the United States would be doing to maintain the role of the dollar, to protect the rules-based trading system, and to punish China. In other words, we need to have an integrated interagency conversation about how this process would work, recognizing that in the event, crisis response would be a top priority for the United States and many other countries.
Let me ask a many other countries question, which is one of the main takeaways is the United States can move unilaterally on this, but as you then discuss in the report, there are actually key areas where allies and partners are necessary. And in fact, at one point you write that all allies would need to revoke China's permanent normal trade status, or PNTR, which here in the United States is, I think it's 60 votes in the Senate. And that also, as a part of this, as a part of the Economic Security Cooperation Board, that board would build capabilities and authorities and have to work with allies and partners to get accurate reporting on trade statistics. That sounds good in theory. Walk me through how you think we build the ability to do either of those. And relatedly, I'm imagining a world in which the gradualness of the tariffs, which I think quite pragmatically you're saying will take some amount of time. I don't think you call for a specific time window, which is sort of up to policymakers here, but something within a 5-year window, 10-year window. That gradualness of how you are ratcheting up the tariffs also gives companies time to find workarounds, and even third country governments don't always have a sense on how complex global value chains are routing. So just walk me through how you think about how we circumvent that problem, both of how do we move unilaterally, but also get some key concessions of partners and allies in a moment of pretty significant geopolitical strife. And then also the gradualness of the tariffs. How do we make sure that there is not a recalibration around the intention of this, but rather you're getting alignment?
I think, and I'll throw this to Hugo in a minute, it's very important to emphasize. We imagine that in this scenario, the United States says, we are going to decouple from China unilaterally because our national interests require it. And we hope and assume that some of our core allies, including, for example, the UK, we suggest that a core coalition might include Canada, Japan, and Australia as well. But this is a loose category. We're not making any assumptions about what these countries would choose to do. But we're assuming that the United States and a relatively small number of close allies choose to decouple, but critically, that they are not demanding that other countries stop trading with China, because we do not think that that is realistic in any circumstance. So the question is, if we are decoupling our own trade with China, but other countries are not, if we want to trade with those third countries, how do we manage the problem of goods from China flowing into our market via those third countries? And the idea, as Hugo indicated in his opening remarks, is we need to say there is a minimum bar. If you want to continue to trade with us, you need to give us credible assurances that you are not transshipping goods from China into our market at scale and lying about it. Those procedures are going to take years to set up, and Hugo can say more about how we would actually operationalize them. But I think the reason why we think this would be politically plausible in Congress is we are assuming, right, at the outset of our scenario, our first assumption is that Congress wants to curtail our trade with China. But we are also assuming that the US has a national interest in not breaking the global trading system and ending up in a trade war with Mexico and Indonesia and Europe and everyone else. And the question is how you square that circle. And the answer is to telegraph in advance that the United States believes that China poses a systemic national security threat. And based on its own interests, it's going to take unilateral action. But it's going to do so in a way that is compliant with the international trading regime. And it's going to work with other countries to help them adapt to that new reality.
Okay, so 2 points on each of your questions, Jude. Ike's absolutely right about the broad framing of it. It's very easy for us to sit in a room and write a report about what the US ought to do in a time of crisis. In practice, this is going to be unbelievably messy. The nature of what we're proposing is that it is beyond the authority of the president. The reason we say that is because the scale of the economic transformation we're talking about is, practically speaking, beyond the authority of the president. That means there's going to be horse trading. That means it's going to be a mess. I do think that it will be possible to get bipartisan consensus for revoking PNTR, given the state of where the China conversation is now. But this is going to look a lot messier in theory in terms of that, in practice, in terms of that ratcheting tariff than it does in theory. There's probably going to, there may be opt-outs, whatever. The key is to understand that it's going to be messy and get alignment on those principles and pathways that can build the biggest coalition possible within the core. And that involves complicated relationships with close allies. We're not in those rooms. We can't imagine those rooms. But if we can get alignment on those principles, that will help us have those negotiations, rather than waking up and trying to do dollar sanctions unilaterally and then acting surprised when the whole thing starts to judder and collapse. On the point about tariffs gradually leading to workarounds, I think this is really interesting. The concept of the ESCB is you have two carrots and one carrot evolves into the second. The first carrot is US immediate financial and dollar support, and we talk about that in the report. To get access to that, initially the bar is going to be very low because these tariffs are ratcheting in, right? So that the level of compliance is actually much lower. Over time, firms are going to make investment decisions based on that reshoring. Even if the reporting of tariffs isn't perfect, you're going to start to get that movement. That creates a pressure from private firms on third countries not to fall foul of reporting requirements and lose access to US and core markets. What we're weaponizing here is a simple fact that the core that Ike mentioned represents 40% of global demand and China represents 15%. And ultimately, that is the thing that the US and its allies have fundamentally to their advantage. China needs to dump products overseas to sustain its system of political economy. We need to import products. Workarounds will exist. It's going to be complicated, it's going to be messy. That's true of all economic statecraft. And we shouldn't try and pretend that any solution is a magic bullet. You're going to lose countries, possibly. We say this in the report. But if we can align incentives based on access to the US market over the long term, we have a coherent pitch to third countries, which is we're going to take the production out of China. Would you like some of that employment? Would you like some of that growth? And the more that happens, and this is why we use that very cheesy photo of the avalanche, right? It begins to acquire its own incentive-led momentum. Doing that through the ESCB is the important final point, not only because it is a more effective way of closing off actors in the worst case scenarios, but also because it is a tool of reassurance to third countries that this is not the US doing protectionism through the back door. This is genuinely about China, and that absent that China case, we're not going to see it return to the world of the 1930s. So that's the answer that's the best answer I can give to you. But any attempt to do economic statecraft is going to have problems with non-compliance, and it's going to be messy, and it's going to be based on horse trading. And we shouldn't duck that. We should just try and work with that to ensure that we get the best incentive-led structure possible, because that is preferable to attempting to do hard decoupling through financial sanctions and failing.
A related question is, I'm just trying to think about implementation of this. You've got, essentially, you're using 232 tariff authority to be the primary ratchet on the longer term process of decoupling. And again, TBD, what the time horizon is for when you go from, status quo of bilateral trade to zero. What is the mechanism by which the strategy of using 232 over time is calibrated to, again, you're having to ratchet in a manner at which you're sticking your landing of zero. You have to articulate what that time horizon is. And then you also have to think about how you gradually step up the tariffs on which sectors and how those tariffs rise over the years such that you get to zero, but you don't create inflationary and employment effects. How is that happening? And also this would conceivably happen across different administrations. So how do you insulate that process both from political wins, but also thinking about that is a slightly a feat of Gosplan engineering, and I'm just trying to think of how are you doing that? And then a related question is, I could see a world, not necessarily the most likely, but you could see a world in which, yes, you see transshipment largely blunted, but you still have most US allies and partners having fulsome, robust trade with China because we're not prohibiting that. And so we're winding down our non-strategic trade with China to zero for widgets and DVD players and clothing, but you've got essentially large chunks of the G7 who are fine in those non-strategic centers. In fact, maybe even looking to expand trade with China. How do we not just end up as the ones holding the isolationist, the protectionist bag?
So two good questions. Let me take 232 and let Hugo talk about the European Union, because I think that's what you're really asking about. On 232, the way that the Trade Act of 1962 is written, this is a presidential authority. It resides between the Commerce Department and the president. So the Commerce Department can initiate an investigation to explore whether some aspect of foreign trade impairs U.S. national security. And they have a period of time for making that finding. Obviously, it can be politically directed. And if they find that it does impair national security, the president then has the right to impose some kind of safeguard mechanisms. This is, by the way, legal not only under U.S. law, it is foundational to the entire rules-based international trading system. It's based in Article 21 of the GATT Charter, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the underlying legal document of the World Trade Organization. And the idea is that states have a legitimate right to make exceptions when national security is concerned. The Trump administration obviously used Section 232 authorities to curtail inflows of steel and aluminum, imposing tariffs on allies as well as on China. And one of the reasons that they did that was because China has been glutting global steel and aluminum markets. And the results of that glut were coming into the United States via third countries and harming U.S. producers. But the Trump administration's use of these measures has also caused some degree of alarm, especially in very trade-dependent allies like South Korea, which fear that the United States will now abuse this tool and use national security pretext to punish South Korea, for example, in the future. So when we think about this authority in the context of a day one crisis, we think Congress needs to take back control for two reasons. First of all, it's one thing to find that steel and aluminum imports from Canada impair U.S. national security. It's another thing to find that all U.S. trade with China, trade of several $100 billion a year, constitutes a threat to national security. We think that this would go beyond the legitimacy of the Commerce Department. It would inevitably create legal wrangling, and it might not hold up in court. That's what we hear from smart legal people we speak to. So if Congress wanted to ensure that this process could continue and without being subject to legal challenge, they would want to enshrine it in Section 232 by changing the language of that provision. And presumably they would add a line that designated China as a systemic national security threat, and then they would describe what the mechanism is. And as you say, Jude, what we're positing is a ratchet mechanism. But this can be calibrated in an infinite number of ways. And I can imagine a world where different industries ratchet at different speeds, different products ratchet at different speeds, because of the character of supply chains. Some things are easier to pull out of China than others. And this would also have to be coordinated in a sense with other U.S. partners that were taking their own decoupling. But the idea is Congress, through consultation with industry and labor and other groups, would figure out the right way to do it and would write that in. So it is, in a sense, an update to the Section 232 regime. The other reason for Congress to take control is that it's very important, if you're going to do something this big in the global economy, that you give market participants and firms some degree of certainty that these things are not going to be reversed in the future after they've made huge investments about where they're going to move their production. And the problem with giving all of this authority to the president is that presidents face midterm elections every 2 years. They face re-election every 4. And they might have an incentive, particularly once the ratchet is in motion, to horse trade, to cut deals, to slow things down, and so forth. So the idea is, once this is written in law, if you can find a way to get it written in law, it has some kind of stickiness, because then you need 60 votes to overturn it.
Okay, so a small point on what this conversation is revealing, and then a discussion about the European Union. What this discussion is revealing is why we've so often fallen back on this traditional sanctions playbook, because it is superficially much easier to do, and moving through the trade space is really complicated and really hard. The reason for that is that when we move through financial services through the position of the dollar, there's a lever that you can in theory pull and then OFAC get to work. And all the problems are downstream in terms of enforcement. When we're thinking about the trade space, you have all of these complicated questions of US action. And then it is the border and rules of origin that are doing the enforcement. And there is a structural pressure on it to be more effective because it's trade, right? And so the reason we wrote this report is to start a conversation, a very complex conversation about how we can design new tools in this space that will be more effective and sustainable over the long term. But the reason that this is all a bit complicated is because the hard work is what happens up front. Let's talk about the European Union, and I'm going to try and talk about this as best as I can as a Brit who is not in the European Union. I think there's been a big change in the EU position on China. I think the invasion of Ukraine has caused a big change in the European position on China. However, I think it is challenging, no matter what you do in terms of economic statecraft, to get the level of coordination in Taiwan crises that we've seen in Russia, which is on Europe's doorstep. I think every signal we have received over a sustained period of time from key EU figures would suggest that. So you have to design something that is possible for the EU to cooperate with, remembering that sanctions and trade policy of this kind are EU-wide in structure, but that does not require and rely on the European Union with its own currency that is very, very widely held, going with the United States in its entirety. Will this lead to us holding the bag of protectionism? I don't think so, because I think the scale of the size of the market we're holding and the decision to draw out the process over time means that you are giving enough time for supply chains to move and develop such that the long-term impact on costs and employment, on inflation and employment, is going to be fairly low. Long-term. Not zero, but low. I also think that, as we have known since Mancur Olson's work, necessity is the mother of invention, and we can't predict that in advance. What I know for certain is that what we can't have is a world in which the United States and its vital allies in East Asia, after a Taiwan crisis, and God forbid, after a successful, from a PRC perspective, Taiwan crisis, are still dependent on China's market with no pathway in sight for breaking that dependence, because that leaves them massively vulnerable to economic coercion from China. And this is what I think of as the sort of time mismatch problem. I think that's Ike's phrase originally, which is that in the long run, because of that point about global demand, the structures are in place, particularly given the Chinese economy at the moment, for us to win at this game. But in the short term, our dependence on China's market leaves us and our close allies in the region very vulnerable to economic coercion, and ultimately very vulnerable, particularly after China had moved against Taiwan, to China being able to set the rules of the road in the global economy to a much greater extent, even than they do today. And that's just not viable for the world system that we are trying to sustain. And so we need to show that leadership, not only for our own economies, but for the economies of our allies, that there is a sustainable path, not to expelling China from the global economy. As you say, China will continue to be, even in this, whatever you do, it's a country of God knows how many people. You can't expel it from the global economy. But what you can do is create a process that builds over time such that China is unable to dominate its own region economically and set the rules of the road. And if you can show that, you can sustain and evolve the rules-based trading system in a way that is basically favorable to US interests and the interests of third countries. And it's threading that needle. That's how I'd answer your question.
Let me ask one question that I want to turn to audience questions, which is we have thus far treated the PRC as if it's this inanimate actor to be acted upon and to watch with sheer horror as this avalanche comes barreling towards it, or I guess, as all the snow slides off its mountain face. When in fact, as you talk about in the report, and well, China's an active player. Not only that, has a pretty fulsome toolkit of economic coercion. And so I wanted to ask you how you think, if Xi Jinping brings you guys into a Politburo study session, he says, guys, this is, let me rephrase it. He takes the Chinese versions of you, because I know you wouldn't go brief the Politburo study session, but let's say
he's got slightly undermine our credibility, but
he's got two analysts of your caliber who are writing the countering avalanche decoupling report. What is in that report? If you were authoring that, what is the best counter avalanche strategy starting today, in the lead up to moving into a crisis, assuming that Beijing is the one who's going to initiate the crisis, and then let's say most importantly for yours, day one through day n, what is the most effective counter strategy that Beijing has, using all of its many tools: diplomatic, economic, military?
Well, Comrade Blanchett, let me take a crack at this. I think the first point is that what this plan aims to exploit is the fact that China under Xi Jinping is increasingly dedicated to a model of political economy that requires massive overcapacity and dumping of products abroad. And that has to do with Xi Jinping's preference for consolidation of power within the state sector, financial repression, all the rest of it. I don't believe that this big bazooka of stimulus that we have seen out of Beijing over the last week changes our structural model about a country that faces chronic overcapacity problems headed towards a deflation trap. I think China continues to need to export in vast quantities. And therefore, I think nothing other than structural reform to reduce those domestic imbalances and support the consumer can mitigate China's vulnerability to our day one plan. And I think that Xi Jinping has demonstrated that he's not politically willing to relax his grip over the economy in that way. So,
all right, comrade, you've just been kicked out of the meeting because Xi Jinping doesn't want to hear about structural reform. What's the plan you put on his what's the plan you put on his desk that you think has a chance of approval, and use the full toolkit Beijing has at its disposal of political influence? Does China have its own punitive strategy that ratchets up with your 232 tariffs, where the areas where the United States and the West is critically vulnerable to choke points that Beijing controls? So yeah. I'm just trying to hear how we think Beijing is realistically going to counter this strategy that doesn't involve tax reform, which I agree they're not going to do.
So yes, that's the right question. So if you assume that they're not going to do the actually effective stuff, I think they would be doing a lot of things that they're already doing. Namely, they would be reminding the world that the world has critical dependencies on them that they could turn off in a crisis. And they have flexed this muscle with gallium and germanium export controls. They continue to do this in small ways across the semiconductor supply chain to remind the world that the day one crisis could be really bad. I think China's stockpiling behavior is not just intended, and they're, by the way, as you know, Jude, they're stockpiling not only oil and food, but all kinds of commodities. That's not just designed to make China's economy capable of being autarkic, sealed off and surviving for 6 months or so, or even longer, if they're cut off completely in a conflict. It's also a signal to the rest of the world. We can bear a lot of pain, and we can protract a conflict longer than you would like. And that is a threat, an implicit threat to a country like South Korea or Singapore, but also to the authorities on Taiwan, to say, don't think that you can outlast us. If we choose to move in whatever way, we are willing to bear more pain for longer than you. And I think that puts the burden on the United States to talk not only about things we can do that are punitive, but also how we would deal with the enormous global financial risks that would emerge in a crisis. I think China can also continue to leverage the carrots and sticks that it has from its own market access to drive wedges within the U.S. coalition. There's a possibility of a change of government coming in South Korea. There's a new government in Japan that seems intent on taking down the temperature in bilateral relations, doing things to keep Japanese and South Korean corporates invested in China's market. Is very helpful because it makes it a more complicated political question for Seoul and Tokyo to align with the United States in advance on what the policy would be. So a lot of the things that Beijing could be doing in the short term, in advance of crisis, have to do, I think, with carrots rather than sticks. In the aftermath of a day one crisis, let's say there's a rupture, there's some kind of major rupture over Taiwan. The United States initiates this plan. I think the best thing that China could do would be to portray the United States as the disruptive actor and to try to drive wedges within the U.S. coalition by offering market access, massive purchases of other countries' stuff, loans and grants to third countries, particularly in the developing world, essentially something like a counter ESCB, but one that is based on bilateral horse trading with Beijing rather than rules. Beijing's calculus, if it chooses to go into a crisis, is that, well, the U.S. has maybe the G7 or the U.S. has its core of advanced economies, but most of the global South is very dependent on China. They're dependent on selling their commodities to China largely, and they're dependent on China for cheap stuff. So, and in many cases for financing as well. So everything that China can demonstrate to say, we are going to be a better partner to you, will help them consolidate that coalition. Unfortunately, as Hugo said earlier, the United States has a winning hand if you imagine this sort of economic conflict becoming protracted, because the United States is capable of offering developing countries something that China is not, which is access to an enormous consumer market that runs a persistent current account deficit. Whereas what China wants is to lock countries into a trading system where they are essentially a captive colonial market, selling commodities to China and having finished goods dumped in their market. And that is a world where a country like Indonesia or Brazil or Kenya would have a very hard time moving up the development ladder. So when the United States thinks about that, I think we need to remember that we're articulating a vision for the global economy that is not just about our traditional developed country partners. We need to be in the game and reminding countries in the developing world, China has crowded you out of opportunities to develop. And in this post-day one order, we would make sure that you have the market access you would need to be able to develop.
The only thing I would add to that, and I think that's absolutely right, is there is a world in which analysts, comrades Fryman and Bromley say, okay, our moment of maximum leverage is immediately at the moment of the crisis, because that is when the world is most dependent on Chinese production. Shut it all down now and survive the deprivation and put maximum pain on them. The problem with that is it completely undercuts China's narrative about what would be happening in a Taiwan crisis and continuity and respect and all the things that China would be saying to maintain support in the global South and with the European Union. So the moment of maximum stick for China is upfront with export and import controls before any kind of discriminatory trade policy has had a chance to really take effect in terms of moving the supply chains. That would be really, really scary. And the US would have to really, really step up in terms of providing support for that. The problem is that those big sticks all accelerate the avalanche. So as Ike says, the best response is to try and do some kind of outreach to third countries. But that reliance on exports always limits what you can do. And those sticks, which would be absolutely terrifying in the short term, and the nightmare scenario is everybody panics and tries to reach an accommodation with China in the event of those sticks, at which point the US is just focused on support and doesn't need to do anything. But those sticks that Beijing has traditionally used only serve in the long term to accelerate some kind of avalanche if the US is gradualist about its approach.
And that's why it's so important, just a final point, for the United States to say with the ESCB, we are offering a pathway to collective resilience against PRC economic coercion. Little countries, you're going to be left out in the cold unless you cooperate with us. But if you cooperate with us and the PRC weaponizes, it says, for example, no more tourists can come to your country. We won't buy your pineapples, whatever it is. You are safe. You can enjoy safety in numbers if you partner with us. And that is something that China can't credibly offer in reverse.
We've only got a few minutes left. Let me just sort of go through a few questions. So one of them is asking whether or not the incentive structure could be inverted to where positive economic inducements could be used to shift China's calculus away from the use of force and seeing the economic value of continued integration with the United States. So this is like I don't know what an avalanche that runs uphill looks like, but this is the inverse of a downward decoupling avalanche.
Short answer. The very act of us talking through how complex full decoupling is reassuring to China because it demonstrates that absent a Taiwan crisis, we wouldn't do it. Beijing often says de-risking is decoupling. This is propaganda. They're de-risking from us. That's what dual circulation is in many ways. But the very act of thinking these problems through seriously has a reassuring effect that sustains that. Let's keep moving through the questions.
You've been in the report, and here you've cast a bit of shade on sanctions. Do you see any role for sanctions as an early deterrent as China, as we have credible signs that China is moving towards a possible invasion or blockade? Do you see a role for sanctions then? And in the aftermath of a crisis, or in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, what sorts of sanctions would you recommend that the United States implement, if any?
Well, everything's on the table. And based on how we responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the full suite of sanctions tools are always going to remain on the table. But we think that the current conversation doesn't adequately address the limitations of sanctions for our national interests, and particularly for these coalition management issues that would be so key in the run-up to a crisis. We don't think the United States needs to threaten or emphasize sanctions. Obviously, good work has been done by the Rhodium Group, by CSIS and others, and your shop as well, Jude. I mean, plenty of thoughtful people have written about how various sanctions packages could be designed. What we are trying to do here is to put a different option on the menu and say, here is a way that you could meet all of the United States' vital national interests and punish China in a very profound way over the long term, regardless of how a dispute over Taiwan worked out, without using any sanctions at all. And because of the limitations that sanctions have had on Russia, I think it's actually quite effective to show that we don't need sanctions to achieve our goals.
Last question. I'm going to reword this a little bit just to make it a little bit more clear. But the analogy of the avalanche, once an avalanche starts, there's no control over it. It is a binary, whereas you're actually talking for a process where you'll need to continually be there on the mountain shoveling the snow downward to ensure that over that window of 5 or 10 years that the tariffs are continued, right? This takes human agency here. What concern do you have that economic costs of this strategy may start to mount in unpredictable ways early on in the implementation of an avalanche strategy, and actually if a future administration says, look, the war is over, there's no need for us to do this. This is proving too costly. So the longer duration of this strategy is actually the Achilles heel.
The longer duration is one of the key reasons why it relies on Congress, and I think it's strange to say we're trusting in the inertia of Congress, but I think once this begins to move, repealing it becomes difficult. Partly, as I say, because it is baked into law rather than presidential executive action. Partly because firms begin to make investment decisions on the basis of it continuing. And in a way, that is the gravity of the avalanche. That's why we talk about market incentives a lot, is that the reason that it's an avalanche, not just shoveling snow, is that once a firm makes a decision on the basis of those tariffs continuing to go up or those quotas continuing to go down, they are then incentivized not to push against the ratchet being repealed or modified. And we've actually seen this with the IRA a bit. And as that legislation has worked through, those incentives have come in, and non-American firms have made investment decisions on the basis of those incentives, that creates a structure against repeal. And I think the reason we talk about an avalanche and are not going to be two lonely academics desperately shoveling snow down a hill is because of those incentives.
We have stuck the landing. It is 1:31, but we'll call it 1:30. Hugo, I thank you so much for this conversation. I just want to say to listeners, we have really just scratched the surface of the report. I think you've gotten the broad brush strokes, but again, this is over 100 pages, and there's a lot of deep thinking here. And more importantly, as both Hugo and I said, this wasn't meant to be the final. The period at the end of the sentence, but actually to be the first really big, thoughtful salvo on a really important topic. So as I've mentioned to both of you before, I find huge value in this report. The areas where I quibble, it's nonetheless, you've now given us something to quibble over, whereas before we did not have the thing to quibble over. And so this will inevitably push the discussion forward and give people something to react at, to debate, to discuss, to build on. So huge congratulations to both of you for a really impressive effort and a real contribution to the discussion. So I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for your time here today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I think the number of viewers here shows the interest in this really vital topic. So thanks, Ike. Thanks, Hugo. Thanks for everyone for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Jude.